Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Facebook Live. My name is Carl Barnes. I'm a meteorologist here at the National Weather Service in Newport, North Carolina, and I'm really glad to be talking to you today. It is National and North Carolina Hurricane Preparedness Week, so the timing is really perfect for being able to, go ahead and start getting hurricanes on your mind. And here in Eastern North Carolina, unfortunately, hurricanes are a fact of life, and it's really in everyone's best interest to go ahead and start thinking about what you need to do. It's hard to imagine. It seems like, Florence, we're still trying to recover from it, but technically 2019 hurricane season does begin June 1st, but it's worth noting that hurricanes don't necessarily live by the rules of when we determine hurricane season is. Perfect example is Anna, which happened 2015. Made landfall near the North Carolina-South Carolina border on May 10th, and today is May 9th. So just think about that. 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago to the day, we were already having tropical storms making landfall here in the Carolinas. So it's never too early to start being prepared and thinking about how you're going to keep yourself and your family safe this hurricane season. So what I'm going to do a little bit is just kind of run through a few basic things that you should be thinking about for hurricane preparedness here for the next couple minutes, allow people time to tune in and start thinking about what kind of questions they have. And then I invite you to go ahead and any questions that you do have, put it in comments and we'll start getting to it in just a couple minutes. So thank you all for tuning in. For those of you just joining, my name is Carl Barnes. I'm a meteorologist here at the National Weather Service. Eastern North Carolina, the weather was beautiful today, a nice warm spring day, mostly sunny skies, completely dry, we really had this whole week has been quite nice, and we'll get a little more active this weekend, but I hope everyone's gotten a chance to get outside and enjoy the weather these last several days. So as we're transitioning to obviously much warmer time of the year, the days are getting longer. The ocean's getting warmer. For those of you who have already been to the beach, we're starting to see people getting into the water. And unfortunately, with that warmer water, with those warmer temperatures comes the increasing threat for hurricanes. So a few things that we do want to talk about as we're kicking off this hurricane preparedness webcast is, we always like to stress one thing, and that is that when you're making your plans for the season, we get a lot of people who say, I'm not going to evacuate unless it's a Category 3, or I'm not going to evacuate unless it's a 2 and it's making landfall within 20 miles of me or something like that. And we really like to stress that that category it's really only telling you one small part of the story of the storm. The category is only based on the maximum wind speed within the whole storm. So that's just one location, the maximum wind speed there. It's not telling you anything about the size of the storm. It's not telling you anything about the other threats associated with the storm. So what we like to stress is when you are making the decisions, when we have a storm approaching, making the decisions to keep you and your family safe, we want you to look at all of the impacts expected from the storm, not just the number of the category of the storm. As we've seen many times in the last several years, and it's still really fresh in our minds with Florence, these hurricanes feature storm surge. That doesn't just happen in and around the eye wall. It happens within, a large area around the storm, and the size of that area varies from one storm to the next. We also have inland flooding. Florence, we had some places that got, almost 3 feet of rainfall. Obviously, that's going to create major flooding concerns, and that more or less had nothing to do with the wind speed. The fact that it was a Category 2 as it was passing just south of us, but that those Category 2 winds really didn't have any effect on the amount of rainfall. Rainfall was the big story from Florence. We obviously have the threat for tornadoes. Florence, I believe we issued close to 30 tornado warnings. We verified a lot of tornadoes. That's another thing where even weak tropical storms can feature a lot of tornadoes. And even though the wind field of the whole storm creates a large area of damage, those tornadoes can create much smaller, more focused areas of heavy to extreme damage within the hurricane. So are you ready if we do have a tornado threat with a storm, regardless of what the category number is? And then we also have, if the storm is staying off the coast, we have rip currents. It's obviously something that would be more focused if you're visiting the beach, it's something you would be concerned with. But just kind of trying to highlight that it's not just about the category number of the storm. You have to consider all of the impacts. So what can you be doing right now? Obviously, we don't have any threat for tropical systems here in the immediate future. We're quiet, as they say, we're quiet in the tropics right now. So what can you be thinking about? First, do you have an evacuation plan? Local emergency managers, local officials recommend that you have multiple ways that you can evacuate your area. And then that way, when we actually have the storm, we have a good idea of the forecast for it, and the evacuation order is issued, you're able to make the assessment of which one of those evacuation routes is going to be best for you. Here in the Morehead City area, we only have a handful of roads that are going to take us inland. So we need to make sure, the Outer Banks, you only have a couple bridges that go on and off the island. So make sure you understand what are those evacuation routes. Maybe have a plan of, all right, these are my 2, 3, 4 evacuation routes that I might be able to go with. And then once we actually have an understanding of what we think the storm's going to do, then make the decision of which one of those evacuation routes do I want to go with. We also, now is a good time to be thinking about building your emergency kit. Some things you're going to want to make sure you have in that kit is water and food. The recommendation is at least 3 days worth of food, and that's just because it's at least 3 days, and that's because that 3 days might be how long it takes before there's any resources available in the area. Those of you who were affected by Florence saw that it takes a while for things to get back up and running. If no one has power, it's going to be really hard for anyone to open back up and provide food. So you need to have, if you decide to stay, you need to have at least 3 days worth of food. And they say 3 to 7 days worth of water. That's a minimum what you need to have. You need to be thinking about any medications that you have. Have to have a good supply of those. We recommend during hurricane season you keep at least a 3-month supply of any of your medications that you have. Are you going to have battery power for your cell phone if the power goes out? Do you have some kind of a backup charger or something like that if you need to use your cell phone? You have blankets and pillows. Do you have enough clothes? Do you have toiletry, hygiene items? A NOAA weather radio is a great thing to have. Very reliable, battery powered. It's a good way for us to get out information, not just before the storm, during the storm, and a lot of times after the storm, we'll be able to distribute any kind of important information that we get from our partners. Something else, think of cash. If the power goes out, nowhere's going to be able to accept a debit or a credit card, so you need to have cash on hand. In the days after the storm, here in Carteret County, we saw things, a lot of businesses, it took them at least a couple days to open back up, and when they were open, if they didn't have power, then cash was pretty much the only way to get what you needed. Be prepared for long lines, be patient when you're out there, because the resources are really stretched thin immediately after a hurricane. When the storm is don't wait for the storm to approach to make sure that you have enough gas. We recommend during hurricane season, always have at least half a tank of gas. It's another thing, once evacuations start, gas stations can start running out of gas, and then if you're not thinking ahead and prepared, then it's going to make things a lot more difficult. Pets, if you have pets, do you know what you're going to do with them? Not all shelters accept pets. Do you have a plan for if you're going to take them with you, do you have somewhere to go that does accept pets? You need to make sure that you have enough food and all that for them. So you have a lot that you need to be thinking about, and that's why we stress that now is the time to start thinking about this, because if you're waiting until a storm's bearing down on us, it's going to be too late to take everything into account. Strengthening your home. Keep your trees trimmed back. Now is a great time to go ahead and trim those trees back from your home to keep broken branches from falling onto your home. Do you have window coverings? If you wait until the storm's bearing down on us, plywood might not be available everywhere. So now would be a good time to be thinking about how you want to cover your windows. Are you going to be able to bring any loose items that are outside? You can be able to bring them inside or secure them down. Now is the time to be thinking about this, so that when the storm is bearing down on us, you're able to take the important steps to keeping you and your family safe. Um, Do you know how you're going to get information leading up to the storm? Do you know who your trusted sources are? Here at the National Weather Service, we distribute information through social media. We distribute it through our website, through NOAA Weather Radio. We're also working closely. The people in the media are our partners. We have very good relationships with local media. So we're often working together to make sure that we're putting out the best forecast we can and putting out the best information to keep you safe. So make sure you know what your trusted sources are and that you have a way to get information from them before, during, and after the storm. And then, of course, you want to develop an emergency plan. So, you know, if the storm does hit, what's your plan for during the storm? What's your plan for the days after the storm? How are you going to be able to make sure that you can get in contact with your family to make sure everyone's safe? You know, check on your neighbors. What's your plan when you know, things potentially go south, so to speak? So that's just a few things that we want to keep in mind, things you can be thinking about now without even having any kind of storm that we're tracking or anything like that. Those are things that you can go ahead and be working on. Appreciate everyone who's tuned in now. We have a couple questions I'll get to. Welcome to those who've just joined us. My name's Carl Barnes with the National Weather Service here in Newport. We're located in Newport, and we cover most of eastern North Carolina. We basically cover from Onslow County, Duplin County, up to Pitt County, and then along the Albemarle Sound, and we cover the Outer Banks and all of coastal areas within that area. So we have a large portion of eastern North Carolina that we cover. We are definitely no stranger to hurricanes. It's actually pretty rare to have a season go by where we're not at least keeping an eye on one, if not several storms. We get impacted by storms, even storms that stay off the coast. We can get large waves, rip currents. Pretty much every hurricane season, we have storms that are having some kind of effect here on eastern North Carolina. So a lot of people who work at this office are very passionate about hurricanes and tropical cyclones, and you know, we really want to do our best to make sure that everyone is ready when and if we do get impacted from hurricanes. So now we'll jump into some of the questions. First one we got, Kelly Lynn, thank you for your question. Any predictions of how active it can get for us this season? So the official prediction, the official outlook from NOAA will be released actually 2 days from today. So that's going to be coming out on May 23rd. So keep an eye out from that. That's going to be our, like I said, the official outlook. But just kind of give you an idea, we are in a weak El Nino right now. Typically, El Nino corresponds with a little bit below normal activity, but there are other things that get factored in beyond just that El Nino. So in terms of the weak El Nino, that might have a little bit of an effect on us being a little bit below normal, but there are other factors such as the temperature of the water across the Atlantic where the storms are going to be forming, the outlook on what the wind speeds are looking like, how active the tropical areas are going to be, like thunderstorm-wise. There's a lot of things that go into this. That's why we have to wait until the middle to end of May before we can put out an outlook, because we have to see how those water temperatures are looking and all that stuff. But just kind of a general idea, right now we're in that weak El Nino, so that's generally indicative of maybe a little bit below normal. But the thing that I really want to stress is that, you know, in terms of the complete activity for the season for all the Atlantic, it doesn't really give you any information on how to prepare for it, because it only takes one storm. We always say that it only takes one. It doesn't matter if that's the only storm anywhere in the Atlantic for that whole hurricane season. If it hits your area, then that was a big season. You know, the outlook is really interesting. A lot of science goes into it, but I definitely want to stress, don't let that influence how you prepare, because it doesn't matter if it's a busy season or a quiet season. All that matters is what hits here and wherever you are located at, and how you are prepared for that. So thank you very much for your question. Sharon Monet, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Can we cancel hurricane season this year due to lack of interest of participants? Trust me, if we could, we would. That is a great question. we'd love just to opt out of hurricane season this year, but unfortunately it is a fact of life here in North Carolina, and so we just do the best that we can. We've definitely been active last couple of years, obviously with Florence and Michael last year, and then even going back to Matthew, and it's just been a very busy several years. So we would love to have at least 1 or 2 quiet years and just kind of let everything get back to neutral. A lot of businesses here in Carteret County and Eastern North Carolina are still closed from Florence, and so definitely, you know, we're here at the Weather Service. We're members of the community too, and we really feel for people who are still trying to recover, and we do hope it's a quiet season. And unfortunately, we need to be prepared for whatever nature decides to throw at us. Here's a good question, Kelly Lynn again. Is Newport an evacuation zone? So knowing your evacuation zone, knowing your vulnerability to storm surge and flooding rainfall is really important. No 2 storms are alike. So just because you didn't get storm surge from Florence doesn't mean you're not going to get storm surge from whatever our next storm is. The recommendation from local officials is that you find out what the elevation is where you live. A lot of counties do have like a GIS site that you can go and access, look at your plot of land, look at where you are, and see, at least get a good idea of your elevation there. Very, very important to get a good idea of your elevation. Then you can go, and also the state of North Carolina has floodplain maps. So you can access those floodplain maps and see, you know, if you're within the floodplain for a 500-year storm or something like that. And that'll give you a good idea of your vulnerability to storms. So yes, portions of North Carolina, portions of Newport specifically are in an evacuation zone. But it all depends on the storm, and it depends on the decision based on the forecast that the local emergency managers and local officials make as to what areas will be evacuated. So again, just because you didn't get flooded during Florence doesn't mean you won't get flooded during the next storm. Lots of locations that didn't get flooded during Matthew, where we also had obviously a lot of rainfall across eastern North Carolina, did get flooded during Florence. So having an idea of your elevation, having an idea of how close you're located to a floodplain is all going to be very important to understand. And now is the time to do that again. Don't wait until we actually have a storm bearing down on us. Now is a good idea. Now is the good time to get an idea of your vulnerability to flooding. So we have Shane Kern says, can you explain the difference between mandatory and voluntary evacuations? Yeah, so that's one thing a lot of people don't know. Here at the National Weather Service, we don't actually make those evacuation decisions. What we do is we get the information, we create the forecast, and kind of give an idea of the expected impacts to local officials, and then they make the decision for their North Carolina. It's made on the county level. They make the decision of what locations need to evacuate. For Florence, we saw a lot of counties decided to do a whole county mandatory evacuation. And the evacuation, it's very important to heed those orders, because it's not just about, you know, during the storm, are you going to be able to, or are you going to be safe to stay during the storm? That is a large part of it. But also after the storm, there's not going to be resources. And the few resources that there are here are going to be stretched very thin. So are you prepared to, I mean, you know, a situation that could arise is, during the storm, it might have nothing to do with the storm. You might slip and fall and break your arm. You're probably not going to have, depending on the storm, but you're probably not going to have availability to any kind of medical services during the storm. Something that has nothing to do with the wind blowing outside with you getting injured or something like that. So they take all that into account after the storm. A lot of trees are going to be down. Transportation is going to be inhibited. Power is going to be out. A lot of times communication is going to be down. I know during Florence, a lot of cell phone towers went down, so there was really no good way to communicate, and or the communication was very limited. And so they take all that into account when they issue these evacuation orders. So that's something, you know, we really say the emergency managers have a good feel for what the storm's going to be like, and they're working with us to get the forecast, and then they understand, okay, how is this going to affect our county? So we really encourage everyone to heed any kind of evacuation orders that are issued by those officials. Um, So we encourage you to continue to submit any questions. For those of you just joining us, hey, thank you for tuning in. My name is Carl Barnes, National Weather Service here in Newport, North Carolina. Just doing this is Hurricane Preparedness Week. It runs through this Saturday. So we're doing this. Facebook Live is something new that we are trying out here at this office. You might have noticed we've done a few over the last week or two. Maybe you tuned in Monday. We did have the community forum here on the Crystal Coast, and that was another experiment with Facebook Live. So we're still working out the kinks of it, but we really enjoy this because it allows us to interact directly with everyone out here in the community. Again, we're part of the community too, so this is really, it's what we're passionate about. We're in the National Weather Service because we care about keeping people safe from weather hazards, and so really appreciate everyone who is able to tune in. After this is over, this video will be saved onto our Facebook page. National Weather Service here in Newport, our social media can actually be found at NWS Morehead City. We are on Facebook and Twitter. We also have our webpage where we put all of our forecast information, weather.gov/Newport. So you can always get your forecast off of that. And then, as I mentioned before, we do work closely with a lot of our media partners and county officials. So we're all putting out the same forecast message. So if we do come to where a storm is threatening, getting information through the local media is also a very good place to get it. So we got a question. Susan Smith says, El Nino or La Nina this year? I believe that we are in a weak El Nino currently. When we're in the weak El Nino or La Nina, it's not as strong of an effect on the hurricane season. So just being in that weak El Nino, we, it doesn't necessarily indicate that we're going to guarantee to have a quieter season than normal, as would typically be expected with an El Nino year. Just taking a look at some of the other questions now. Yeah, so Deanna Willis, thank you very much for your comment, and you bring up a great point. So she basically mentions that she works with Hope for NC, who is part of the disaster recovery process, and a lot of things that they're noticing are people who had issues with their insurance, maybe didn't have the coverage that they needed before the storm. So really want to reiterate that now is the time to get with your insurance company and get an evaluation of how complete your coverage is. One thing to point out for flood insurance, I believe it takes something like 30 days before flood insurance actually goes into effect. So even if you got it today, it wouldn't be in effect for the start of the hurricane season. So that's something where if the storm's 5 days out and it's looking like it's going to impact us, and you wait till then to get flood insurance, it's too late. Or really any kind of insurance, I believe it usually takes at least a week, but flood insurance I think is 30 days. So now is the time to contact your insurance company, get an evaluation, make sure you are completely covered. So it might be a little bit of an inconvenience now to do that, but it's going to definitely prevent a huge headache after the storm when resources are so thin. We see here along the Crystal Coast after Florence, we were running into issues of contractors being very limited. So if you're having to figure out your insurance at that point and then get contractors, it's just gonna slow down the recovery process that much more. So now is the time to work with your insurance company, make sure you are completely covered, make sure you have all the insurance you need, because if you do find out you need something, it's gonna take a little while before that actually takes effect. Okay, got another good question. Why doesn't New Bern have an official river observation forecast gauge? That is a really good question. So we, especially during storms where we're, if people are evacuated and communications go down or something like that, we really rely on our observations to be about the only way that we have an idea of what's currently going on. and how we verify the forecast that we've made. So those river observations, water level observations, are really, really critical during storms for us to have an idea of what the storm surge is looking like. For areas away from the immediate coast, helps us monitor flash flooding by having the river gauges that we can see how quickly the river is increasing. So those are really important to us. In terms of the location of those gauges, unfortunately, we don't have much of a say in those. The funding comes from different areas. A lot of times it'll come from the state or county level, so they'll get to determine where those gauges are. But we do our best with what we have, and then we also have the USGS has the capability to what they call rapid deployment gauges. These are really, really cool. They actually are gauges that they temporarily, when they know a hurricane's coming or a hurricane's going to affect an area, they're gauges that they can go out and temporarily attach to locations that are near the water, and they can put it in areas that they know are vulnerable. So before Florence, we had, off the top of my head, maybe 10 or 15 rapid deployment gauges that were deployed along the coast, that areas where we don't have a permanent observation, we were able to get data during the storm. And that was very beneficial to have. So these areas like New Bern that can be affected by these storms, we will normally get those rapid deployment gauges. That said, they don't replace permanent gauges, certainly not claiming that they're necessarily as good as permanent gauges, but you know, any observations that we can get during the storm when people should be hunkered down inside. We don't want you going out and taking observations, putting your safety at risk to give us observations or something like that. We want these automated gauges. So those, you know, those rapid deployment gauges are something that are very helpful. But yeah, certainly a tide gauge in New Bern would be great, and it would be something that's really beneficial. During Florence, we saw you know, 8 to 10 feet across a good part of the coast, or the shoreline of the Neuse River up there around New Bern. Our storm surge estimates were somewhere around 8 to 10 feet above normal. So that's something else I want to talk about, is when you see our storm surge forecast, you're going to see us say it's the height above ground level. So that is at the normal, basically at the normal water level for a lot of the area. Like rivers, it's going to be the normal water level. And then along the coast where it's more tidal, it's going to be more or less the location of a normal high tide. So if you were standing right on the edge of the water with your toes just touching the water, and it's, you know, that's going to be our normal water level. And then so what we're telling you, inundation above ground is going to be the height above that. So if you're standing there and we're saying, like in New Bern, we're forecasting 7 to 11 feet of storm surge. So if you're standing with the tips of your toes right on the water and we're saying 7 to 11 feet of storm surge, you can visualize. For me, I'm 6 feet tall, so that's at a minimum 1 foot over my head to maybe as much as 5 or so feet above my head. So that really gives you an idea. And then as you go inland, or as you go away from the immediate edge of the water, that's where it's very important to know your elevation, understand the flood maps, what we were talking about earlier. Like I said before, a lot of counties have resources where you can get your elevation, GIS websites, stuff like that. You know, if you can't figure that out, contact your county officials. And then the state of North Carolina has floodplain maps where they have drawn the areas that are vulnerable to flooding. I think they have maybe 100-year floods and 500-year floods. So if you look at those, that'll tell you, okay, how close am I to a floodplain? I'm in a floodplain. I need to be thinking about the potential for flooding during a tropical system. All right, so kind of just to come back around for those of you just joining us, my name's Carl Barnes. I'm a meteorologist here at the National Weather Service in Newport. We cover a good portion of eastern North Carolina, basically from an area east of 95, and then we go up to about the US Highway 64 corridor, so they're just south of the Roanoke River and Albemarle Sound. We cover the Outer Banks, we cover the Crystal Coast, and we cover down to Onslow County. So we have a lot of areas that are vulnerable to hurricanes. We have a lot of areas with a history of being impacted by hurricanes, storm surge, flooding, rainfall. tornadoes, and the high winds associated with hurricanes. So this is National and North Carolina Hurricane Preparedness Week. That's why we're doing this live Q and A, is to kind of make sure that everyone's already thinking about what they can do to keep themselves and their families safe. I encourage everyone to ask questions as we're going along, and I'll be happy to answer them. And pretty much just keep going. As long as we're getting questions, I'll be happy to help you out with whatever you need. So we got a question from Ryan Ellis asking, can you talk about the biggest dangers after the storm has gone, particularly inland flooding like we saw, especially with Matthew, and the importance of remaining diligent about flooding when trying to access areas that may be cut off by flooding long after the storm is gone? Great point, Ryan. So this is something that we saw, like you mentioned with Matthew, that river flooding extends far beyond when the actual storm is, the winds and the rainfall is falling. It extends far beyond that. And then we also saw in Florence where it was a very similar situation where the rain fell and then it took a while to get into those larger rivers, and then the rivers flooded. So after the storm, and this is something that is actually a really important part of being prepared, is what are you going to do after the storm? How are you going to get an idea of what routes are available? After Florence, there were roads that have never been shut down before that were shut down and preventing people from getting back into the area. I know a large section of Interstate 40 was closed down due to flooding from the Cape Fear River. Highway 70 coming back into eastern North Carolina was shut down in Kinston because the Neuse River was flooding the road. And that was not shut down for a couple hours. That was shut down for several days. And all told, it was a situation where almost every way back into eastern North Carolina was closed. And so people who had evacuated inland had no way of getting back. And that's a very difficult situation. We understand that after the storm leaves, you're concerned for your property, and just hearing stories about what's going on, maybe hearing updates from neighbors or something like that is, it's helpful, but it's not necessarily enough. And we definitely sympathize with that. But we want to stress that you need to heed the advice of local officials. They understand what's going on. If they say you're not going to be able to get back, you're not going to be able to get back. They want you to get back as quickly as possible. But if the roads are flooded, there's unfortunately not much we can do about it, and we don't want people trying to drive through flooded roadways. The vast majority of deaths with hurricanes in recent history in North Carolina have been from the freshwater rainfall associated flooding with those storms, and lots of those are people trying to drive through flooded roadways. So you've survived the storms, you've survived the wind and the storm surge and all that, and then after the storm, when flooding's still going on, people go out, try to drive through these flooded roadways and get swept off the road. So that's why we really want to, if that flooding's still going on, they stress that you need to heed the advice of local officials. If they say don't come back yet, don't come back. I guess the biggest thing in this situation is just practicing patience and understanding that everyone's doing the best that they can. So what exactly is that about? So Florence came and went. And the reason that this flooding lasts so long afterwards is all that rainfall goes and it runs off into the creeks. And then from the creeks, it takes a while to get to the main rivers. So for Florence, we had flooding well inland into the Piedmont of North Carolina. And then even beyond that, where there wasn't necessarily flooding, there was still rain falling. And all that rain takes a while to run off into the creeks and streams and then come downstream. And that's why it's such a delay, and it can go on so long after the storm leaves, is because it just takes that water a while to move downhill and come back toward the coast. So the flooding that occurred in Kinston for a week, 2 weeks after the storm, the really significant flooding, wasn't necessarily, or it wasn't storm surge that was causing that. It was all the runoff from the rainfall that fell in that area and all the areas along the Neuse River inland. So that's something you need to account for when you're making your evacuation plan is, okay, if it does take me a week before I can go back, what am I going to do? So yeah, thanks for your question, Ryan. I really appreciate it. And just a reminder, anyone who does have a question, feel free to put it in the comments. Also, this video will be on our the National Weather Service Newport Morehead City Facebook page after this is over. If you're going back and watching it later, then you can add comments then, and we will check back occasionally and try to reply to your comments with any answers. To reiterate some things that I said earlier in the broadcast, the outlook for the 2019 hurricane season, the official outlook from NOAA, is actually due out 2 weeks from today on May 23rd. So that's when we'll get an idea of what NOAA is thinking for how busy this season is going to be compared to normal. But we want to stress that that is an outlook for the whole Atlantic basin. So that's not saying anything about here locally in eastern North Carolina. It can be a very quiet year with only 1 or 2 storms. But if one of those storms makes landfall, or it doesn't even have to make landfall, just impacts us here in eastern North Carolina, it doesn't matter how busy the rest of the season was. It only takes one storm to make an impact. And that's why now is the time to prepare. Now is the time to take the steps to keep you and your family safe, because it doesn't really matter what the outlook is. It matters what the storms do, and it only takes one storm to impact us here for, as a lot of people found out during Florence, for really, this is an exaggeration, for your life to be changed and your life to be completely different for, in some instances, an extended period of time. There's still businesses that are just opening back up from Florence, and there's still some that are still closed. So it's really Florence being fresh in everyone's mind. Hopefully, as we go into this hurricane season, it'll help encourage people to make sure they're prepared for whatever else comes at us. But it's definitely, we're not just spinning our wheels, we're saying all this for a reason. All right, so Sarah Jameson, thank you for your question, said, can you explain the influence of El Nino on hurricane season? So I'll try to do this without getting too scientific. Obviously, here we are all, we're weather nerds, and we, we're looking at the forecast and thinking about weather every single day. So we have a tendency to really dig deep into the science a lot of times. So the basic overview of why El Nino affects hurricane season is hurricanes have a handful of things that basically ingredients that they have to have before they'll form. A few of them, they like warm water. They have to have some kind of initial disturbance that'll cause the hurricane to form. They like what we call low shear environments. That basically means that the wind speed up near where the top of the storm is and near the bottom of the storm are pretty similar. So you can also think of it as just, in general, they prefer light winds. And El Nino, the reason that El Nino can has shown before that it can lead to a little bit quieter hurricane season in the Atlantic is because the El Nino is based on water temperatures out in the Pacific Ocean. And so those water temperatures have an effect around the globe. It's not just where those water temperatures vary out in the Pacific. The effects of it are felt around the globe. And what we often see during El Nino years is that the jet stream, which contains stronger winds and is usually up north of our area, can dip further south than normal and bring those stronger winds down further south. And so that increases the amount of what I talked about before, shear. And so when we have that stronger shear, that inhibits hurricane formation out in the warm basin of the North Atlantic, where they typically like to form. So the main factor that causes El Nino to kind of activity is that those stronger winds and stronger shear that result from it. Thank you for your question. Just a reminder, Hurricane Preparedness Week goes through Saturday. You can follow us, NWS for National Weather Service, Morehead City on, obviously Facebook is what we're on right now, but we do also have a Twitter account. We're going to continue to put hurricane preparedness information on those accounts. I invite you to share it. Please comment with any thoughts that you have about it. Also, Facebook Live, like I mentioned before, it is a newer thing that we're trying out. So if you have feedback on how you think this is going, if you like it or you hate it or anything that you think we can improve, please feel free to leave that in the comments. This is something that we might be able to use when we are in more stressful situations. When a hurricane or something like that is bearing down on us, we might be able to use Facebook Live to put out a quick update without having to take the time to prepare graphics, which is a little more time consuming. So this is definitely a service that we're excited to be able to use, and we'd appreciate any feedback as we continue to refine how we use it. So I'll make one more call for any questions that we have. Again, if you're watching this later, we invite you to leave a question in the comments section, and we'll check back into the comments section occasionally and try to answer those questions. Really appreciate everyone who tuned in this evening. Really enjoyed being able to talk to you and try out this new Facebook Live platform, and really encourage you to take what we're saying to heart and prepare now, get that insurance checkup, have your emergency kit prepared, understand your evacuation routes, understand your vulnerability. Are you in an area that could flood? What's your elevation? Even if you're not in an area that floods, are your ways out of town or back into town to where you live? Are those areas that are susceptible to flooding, and how are you going to be prepared if where you live is inaccessible? Just a lot of things to think about as we come into hurricane season, and understanding that Florence is still fresh in our minds, but the next storm isn't. It's not going to be Florence, but we don't know what it is going to be. And just because you didn't get storm surge during Florence doesn't mean you're not going to get it during whatever our next storm is. Just because you didn't flood from rainfall during Florence doesn't mean you're not going to get it during the next storm. So really understand your vulnerability and take whatever actions you need to now to be prepared for the season, and keep yourself and your family safe. So seeing no more questions, I'll go ahead and wrap this up. Again, I really appreciate everyone who tuned in as we're trying out this Facebook Live thing. Hurricane Preparedness Week 2019 still has 3 days left. So, once we cross past Saturday into Sunday, don't think that it's over and you don't need to prepare anymore. This is something where we're always going to stay active and stay busy doing this. Yeah, again, I really appreciate everyone tuning in. Again, my name is Carl Barnes from the National Weather Service here in Newport, and hope everyone has a good evening and has been able to enjoy the nice weather we've had the last couple of days. So I'll go ahead and sign off. And again, if you're watching this video later, leave us a comment, leave us feedback, leave us a question, and we'll try to get back to you. Thank you very much. Have a good night.